Okay, cool. So that's what nativism means. And the reason I think it's an interesting lens, I don't think it explains all of politics in 2016, but the reason I think it's an interesting lens is, as Victor said, meaning matters, right? So this is just a graph to throw a little bit of a wrench in the works. When we look at the income of the bottom 20% in real terms, so in terms of what it can buy, since 1980, it's gone up 46%. All these crises of American, and this is in America, by the way, sorry. All these crises of democracy, all these narratives about X group or Y group being disempowered have happened at a time of increasing prosperity. Yes, increasing inequality, but increasing prosperity for everyone. And so the stories we tell matter because, one, this is not peak inequality time, that was in the past, and actually we're seeing an improvement in the situation as far as things go. But two, how are we able to turn prosperity, even prosperity for the poorest in society, into a situation of siege, right? And that's the sort of question that an anthropological perspective helps with, because again, we're focused on sort of how people live and experience their worlds, right? Economic realities may be one thing, but meaning can be something entirely different. So the idea of everyday nativism, one thing that I work on, comes from, again, this idea of everyday sexism, which some of you may have come across. There's this really phenomenal project called the Everyday Sexism Project. If you haven't heard of it, I encourage you to check it out. But the Everyday Sexism Project is about drawing attention to the ways in which sexist discrimination is baked into our everyday culture. The ways in which the ways we talk consciously but also unconsciously have ways of discriminating against women and putting them down and disempowering them in different ways. So this is a UN ad campaign based around that idea. It's a little bit blurry, I apologize. But it's kind of Google search term suggestions coming up over these women's mouths. And so the one on the left, women shouldn't, and then it's suggesting have rights, vote, work, or box. The one on the my left, you're right. Women need to be put into place, know their place, be controlled, or be disciplined, right? So this idea that these ideas might not even be something that we say out loud, but there's something that we say in millions of small little ways in the ways that our cultures are structured. So how does this work? Let's focus on sexism for a second, right? This is a Lynx advert. It's to sell deodorant to men, and by and large, the branding strategy has been to suggest, largely to teenage boys, that wearing this rather pungent deodorant will get women to fling off their clothes and sleep with them. And so in this particular ad campaign, even angels will fall, the idea that it has this sort of irresistible allure to women across the world. This is a deodorant campaign aimed at women. Now, it's not selling her as the object of the way the Lynx campaign is, but you can see a similar aesthetic in some of these, some of the ways the ads are constructed. Now, the thing that makes this difficult is that this doesn't make this wholesale disempowering to women, right? There's an idea that, women should have control over their own bodies, and that's something almost everyone would take, everyone in this room, I would assume, would agree with. And there's this idea of, empowerment and vitality and joy, and there's a lot of positive things going on here. But it's also one that fits a particular image. There's ambivalence, where these two models don't look so different from each other, right? And so what might be experienced as empowering by one party might also signal to men who've grown up with this idea that they have the right to claim something from women who look like this, even when the women themselves do not think that, right? And so there's the idea that discrimination, the idea that, for instance, men have a right to women, can be built into cultural DNA, can be built into the ways we think of things like joy and vitality and ambition and aspiration. And that's part of the idea of everyday sexism, right? That we're all somehow a little bit complicit, no matter our best intents. And it's a little bit of a scary idea. Now, the question I want to ask is, this is nativism, right? This is nativism kind of pure and simple, where we have a privileged white man saying, be afraid of the scary brown people, right? And this is quite explicit. But the question is there a form of nativism that looks like this? Is there a form of nativism that isn't just one bought into by privileged white men, but in fact that we are all maybe complicit in? And I want to suggest, that this is in fact the case. Because it's something I came across doing work. So this is a picture of South Kilburn. This is the council estate on which I did a lot of my ethnographic research. And I sort of gave you a little bit of a profile, but it's very mixed, very high turnover in population. It is a majority-minority area, so white people of all definition. There's a lot of Irish people there who have a history of exclusion of their own, who fit within that white category. But that whole white category is under 30% these days. And yet, come across some very interesting things. So these are some long quotes, but I thought I should give other people a little bit of a chance to talk as well. And I want to give you a chance to just read them and take a break from my voice. Sorry, I'm in the way a little bit. Okay, does anyone need more time? Right. So this is the sort of thing I ended up encountering quite a lot doing field research. People kind of going, oh, I know UKIP are kind of racist, but actually there's something a little bit appealing about what they say. Oh, I know I'm an immigrant or I come from an immigrant background, but isn't immigration out of control these days? And making these sorts of very double-edged statements that become very interesting and struck me as something worth investigating, right? And this was one of the most striking ones I came across, where basically, to sum up what's going on here, I'm having a conversation with Frank, who is in his mid-50s, of Afro-Caribbean descent, was born in the UK, but to very recent immigrant parents. And he goes like, you know, I don't like Nigel Farage and UKIP because they're obviously racist, but you have to understand that he's the sort of man you could have a pint in the pub with. Do you understand what that means? I go, yes. He goes, do you understand what that means? I go, yes. He goes, do you understand what that means? And I go, yes. But he keeps insisting, and he doesn't explain himself, right? He keeps sort of talking in circles that Farage is appealing because you could have a pint in the pub with him. And this is somehow an explanation sufficient in itself. I want that idea to come across, that somehow saying that should mean that you don't have to explain anything else, because that's an idea I want to come back to at the end. So this is apparently the type of guy you could just talk to. What does that mean? Well, I want to take a step back, and I want to take a look at some evolutionary anthropology for a second. And if there are any evolutionary anthropologists in the room, I apologize, because I'm probably massacring this. Robin Dunbar, famous guy, came up with a very famous theory known as Dunbar's number, which was about tribe size. He actually started out by working on monkeys and found a correlation between the size of basically a primate's neocortex and the size of the social group it tended to keep. And he wondered if this applied to humans. So he dug through a whole bunch of data on sort of human group size, everything from tribes to businesses, and found this sort of estimate of 150. And this is what's famously known as Dunbar's number, and this is the version of the theory that kind of the popular media has picked up on and sort of in popular science. Human tribes tend to kind of even out at around 150. If they grow too large, if they sort of cross a 200 threshold, they tend to fragment into smaller groups, right? The interesting thing is he's gone on to do more work, and this is a little bit less well known, that suggests even within that 150, there's a hierarchy, right? So there's 3 to 5 people we think of as sort of intimate and very close, and people we have sort of these total understandings with, right? And then there's 9 to 15 people we consider very good friends or something on that level. 30 to 45 is sort of like acquaintances. And then 150 people we know and interact with on a regular basis, right? People we know and we still feel positively about, but sometimes we might even forget their name. And one way to think about this, the way this goes, is, this is a suggestion from some other psychologists, and they haven't connected that, but I found this fun, is something that's sometimes referred to as like the naked photo test. So if for some reason an embarrassing photo of you turned up, and you had to entrust it into the care of someone else, who would that someone else be? You had to do this, you know, it's sort of like psychological experiment logic. You can't burn the photo. It has to be kept by somebody. You can give it to them in an envelope and trust them not to peek, maybe. But who would you give it to? Those people go in the central circle. The people who would pass this test go in your central circle. This might be your partner. This might be your closest friend. This might be a parent. It'll vary from one to another. But the idea is that we have a fundamental inability to have too many people in that central circle, because these are quite complex relationships, right? Meanwhile, in the outer circle is sort of this big, diverse world in which we live and sort of live within a part of. These are the people who sort of make up our day-to-day world writ large, right? And there's sort of the scales, again, along the side to help you out. Everybody sort of comfortable with that so far? This sort of hierarchy of acquaintances? Right. Now, the interesting thing, and again, this is sort of even less well known from Dunbars theory, is that as we move outwards, as we move to these sorts of broader and broader hierarchical groups, we don't just sort of become less familiar with people, but we start thinking of people in functional terms. So if somebody asked you to define the value of somebody who goes in your inner circle, be that your lover or your parent or your sibling, yes, you could give them a label like I just did, but actually saying what they mean to you would be quite a difficult thing. It would encompass a lot of good and a lot of bad, a lot of complexity. You certainly couldn't put a price tag on them, and you certainly couldn't sum it up in a sentence or two. Whereas somewhere out here is your doctor, or your teacher, or your fireman, if you're really well acquainted with your fireman. In which case, you should probably stop burning things down. And so the idea is, as we move out in this direction, there's a move from sort of personal relationships, which are sort of in their nature ambiguous and open-ended and lack definition, really, because we're sort of willing to let them evolve and be complicated, to functional relationships, right? And so this is just me sort of paraphrasing what these sort of different levels might mean to us, right? The people who we're most intimate with, there's no need to explain ourselves to them. There's no need for them to explain ourselves to us. The people who we're good friends with, we might know that they're kind of mixed up. We might not even know everything about them. But you know what? We like them as a whole. It's complicated, and that's fine, right? Our acquaintances, yeah, they're all right. And then in this sort of broader sphere, we're into the functional sphere. And it's this functional sphere that's important. Why? One, and this is like, you know, when people say research is standing on the shoulder of giants, this is sort of my tiny contribution to this conversation, are these red arrows. Is that the more we sort of think of relationships in intimate terms, the more fluid we allow them to be. The more allowing we are of change, of complication, of the good and the bad rolled together. We're not just going to toss that relationship out because it's not working for us. The more we think of relationships in functional terms, the more we expect them to be fixed. The more we expect them to be in a certain way. So we can think of friends who we hang out with mostly because they're fun. We know they're kind of crap people, or we know that they kind of maybe, you know, don't have the best hygiene. I don't know what it is with your complicated friends. But if they're your fun friend and they stop being fun, you might start questioning that friendship, right? More to the point, if the fireman stops putting out fires, get a new fireman, right? If your doctor is not curing you, get a new doctor. It doesn't matter how much you like that person in terms of the glimpses of their personality you get, because mostly they are a function to you, right? So here's the stranger, right? What questions do we ask when we encounter strangers? The first one might be about this sort of closer interpersonal understanding, the thing that characterizes the fluid type of relationship. Are we likely to understand him or her? Is he or she likely to understand us? And with a lot of strangers, the answer to that is likely to be no. Unless they sort of very strongly signal something that is familiar off the bat. We went to the same school, or you know, grew up in the same city, and there seems to be like some strong resonances, and these things happen. In a lot of instances, we will dismiss these conclusions, right? So we lose these first three rings, putting them in this latter category, right? Do your job right, and we'll get along just fine. And then the question we ask is, are we likely to be able to work towards common ends? Can this person serve a function alongside me in my life? Now, why does all of this matter, right? Two reasons. One, when people say UKIP politicians are the sorts of people who you can have a pint in the pub with, they're expressing a frustration with these sorts of functional relationships. They're saying we want people with whom there's no need to explain. In point of fact, if you remember back to that earlier quote, Keith is refusing to explain why he likes Nigel Farage. Most of these explanations I come across, in fact, refuse to explain what they're on about. There's sort of tautologies baked into them. And so it's this view of politics that says it's gotten too functional, it's gotten too distant, and we don't think they're doing their job right. We're not happy with the functional politicians because they're bad politicians. We think they serve someone else's interests. We think they're distant. We don't think they fit our social world. And in that context, we're retreating to sort of a more intimate idea of what politics should be, right? It's not about policy, it's about relationships. But two, this matters because when we encounter people in the abstract, we tend to encounter them on this categorical level. So if you meet somebody from another background, they are defined by their background or as an immigrant, right? They're defined in sort of these functional categorical terms, not in these fluid human terms, right? And then the discourses we have about these sorts of people matter tremendously, because what job do immigrants do within our society, right? If we have a very negative, very burdensome discourse of what immigrants are within society, if they're seen as drains or scroungers or people trying to take advantage or people trying to convert, you know, the nation into Sharia law and then deport all the women or something mad like that, if those are the discourses we have circulating around the public, then our first basis for judging these people is not going to be a good one. We're not going to see the value that these people can have within our lives, right? Which is to say that the categories that we craft for public types of people matter tremendously. This is also perhaps a way of thinking about losing faith in experts, right? Because the less these people do for us, the more we push them out and out and out. And if we push them too far, they fall outside of that sphere of 150. There is, for the evolutionary psychologists, some debate around this number, but the principle tends to hold quite nicely, that there is a spectrum, right? So I want to leave you on that note, this idea that, one, we're looking for a little bit of intimacy, and that a lot of our discourses, we should listen as sort of cries for people to kind of have a more natural world, a world in which they don't want to explain themselves, because they feel that forces like diversity and forces like rapid change within modern society are making them explain themselves more and more, are threatening these sorts of pint-in-the-pub relationships. But two, we should pay attention to the sorts of conversations we have in public about people whom we can't be intimate with, for people who exist in the first instance as categories. And so the questions I want to ask you are about this sort of gap between rational and emotive relationships. So thank you.